Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. You know that feeling, don't you? That little knot in your stomach when English conversation is going well, and then silence. You've said what you prepared, you understood their last sentence, but now the ball is in your court, and your mind just goes blank. What do you say next? How do you keep it flowing? Look, it happens to everyone, and it can be especially frustrating when you're speaking a language you're still, mastering.
Absolutely. That moment of awkward silence, it can feel like a spotlight is suddenly glaring on you, right? And the
Yeah.
pressure to fill it is just, well, immense. It's such a common point of anxiety for language learners. But the truth is, and our sources really back this up, keeping a conversation going smoothly isn't some like innate talent you're born with. It's actually a skill. It's built on surprisingly simple techniques and crucially understanding some cultural expectations too.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've pulled together a fascinating stack of material that really dissects this very challenge. So our mission here is to extract the core insights, those practical tricks that can help you navigate those moments with more confidence. We're going to explore how to ask questions that genuinely invite conversation, not shut it down, and how to structure your answers so they offer these natural hooks for the other person. We'll also look at those almost invisible little words and phrases, the ones that make native speakers sound so fluent, and of course, how to gracefully change topics when the time is right without that awkward jolt.
And crucially, we'll dig into the cultural landscape beneath English conversations. Those often unspoken rules around things like small talk, which is huge,
Hmm.
and the power of maybe sharing a little personal story, and how to show you're actively engaged as a listener. Because understanding these cultural underpinnings is, I'd argue, just as important as the vocabulary and grammar itself.
hmm So settle in. By the end of this deep dive, you should have a whole toolkit ready. Those silences, they'll start to feel less like a trap and maybe more like an opportunity. You'll be equipped to keep the conversation ball in the air and feel genuinely more comfortable and confident speaking English. Let's unpack all of this.
Let's do it. Sounds good.
So, based on the sources, where's the most common place people stumble? Like the first hurdle when trying to keep a conversation alive.
Well, the sources consistently highlight that one of the biggest initial hurdles is how people frame their questions. They often fall into the trap of asking what our material calls dead-end questions.
Dead-end questions. I love that term. It perfectly captures what happens, doesn't it? What exactly makes a question a dead end?
Okay, so a question becomes a dead end when it's structured in a way that the easiest, most natural, and often kind of expected answer is just a simple yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
Think about questions starting with, are you, do you, did you, is it, can you, the type.
Right. Like, are you enjoying the party? Or did you see that movie? Or do you like pizza?
Precisely. Those exact kinds. If the other person just says yes or no, which, they are entirely able to do with these question types, right? The conversational exchange just stops
Yeah.
immediately. There's nowhere for the conversation to flow naturally from there without someone, either you or them, having to make a significant effort. You basically have to restart the engine, introduce a whole new point, or ask a completely unrelated follow-up. It puts all the burden on the next speaker.
Okay, that makes total sense. So how does the source material suggest we fix this? How do we turn those dead ends into like open pathways for conversation?
The core technique, the one advocated really strongly by our sources, is to deliberately move away from questions that just invite a simple yes or no. Instead, you formulate questions that require a more descriptive response. And the key here, the simple trick, is to use question words like what, how, or why.
Ah, the classic open-ended questions. We've probably all heard about these, but the sources really emphasize why this specific shift works so well, right? It's not just grammar.
Exactly. It's not just about sentence structure. It's about prompting a different kind of retrieval or thought process from the other person.
Yeah.
It makes them dig a bit deeper. The source uses a really clear comparison, which I think illustrates it perfectly. Ask someone, do you like music?
Yeah.
The most efficient and complete answer is yes. Conversation over. Potentially.
Right, dead end versus the open-ended version.
The open-ended version using what would be something like, what kind of music do you like? Or what music are you listening to lately? Now, see, they can't just say yes. They're prompted to access their internal knowledge, their preferences, their recent listening habits. They have to offer categories or examples. They might say, oh, I listen to a lot of indie rock and some jazz. Or maybe my taste is really varied, everything from classical to hip-hop. But lately I've been really into salsa music.
And look how that instantly gives you so much more to work with. Instead of one syllable, you get multiple potential avenues for follow-up. If they say indie rock and jazz, okay, now you can ask about specific artists they like in those genres, or maybe where they go to hear live jazz. If they mention salsa, you could ask, oh, cool, where do you listen to salsa? Or do you dance salsa? Or how did you get into that?
Yes, precisely. The answer itself contains the seeds for the next part of the conversation. It's built right in. The sources really point out that this type of question naturally encourages the other person to elaborate, to provide details, opinions, or examples. And those details, those are the golden nuggets. They're the very things you can then react to or ask further questions about.
It shifts the whole dynamic, doesn't it? From like a closed loop question, yes, no, stop, to more like an expanding tree where each answer sprouts new branches of conversation. And the source gives another great layer to this, asking why.
Right. That's a powerful one. Once they've given you a descriptive answer using what or how, you can often follow up with why to delve deeper into their reasons or motivations. So if they said, oh, I love rock music, my favorite band is Coldplay, you could then ask, oh, interesting, why do you like Coldplay so much? Or what is it about them you connect with?
Yeah.
This moves beyond just their preference Coldplay to the reason behind it, the feeling.
And that's often where you get the more personal insights, isn't it? The stories, the feelings associated with their preference. Why questions often unlock the most engaging parts of the conversation.
Precisely. They might talk about the lyrics resonating with them, or the incredible energy of their live shows, or maybe how a particular album helped them through a specific time in their life. Now you're having a much richer, more connected conversation than just establishing the fact that, yes, they like music. So the key takeaway, as the sources emphasize, is practicing thinking in terms of what, how, and why when you're formulating questions, especially when meeting someone new or just trying to get a conversation going. Instead of, did you have a good weekend? Yeah, try, what was the highlight of your weekend? Or how did you spend your weekend? It just opens things up so much more.
It makes so much sense. You're basically forcing, well, not forcing, but inviting a more detailed response right from the start. Start with questions that command more than a single syllable, and the conversation had a much better chance of taking off. Okay, so asking good questions is one side of the coin, super important. But what about when you're the one answering? Because our sources point out that giving really short replies is another major conversation killer, right?
Absolutely. It's the other half of the equation. You could be talking to someone who is like the world champion of asking brilliant, open-ended questions. But if your answers are consistently minimal, just one or two words, the conversation will still fizzle out. It really is a two-way street.
So give us the classic example from the source material on this one.
Okay, the sources use the simple question, do you like traveling? Now, as we just discussed, this is technically a yes-no question, which isn't ideal. But even if the question were better, say, what do you like about traveling? A really short answer would still be a problem. But sticking with do you like traveling? The most minimal conversation-stopping answer is just yes.
Right, full stop. And just like with the dead-end question, that simple yes leaves the other person with absolutely nothing specific to respond to, nothing to grab onto. They have to pull a completely new question out of thin air just to keep things moving. It's back to square one.
Exactly. There's no information hook. There's no detail to react to, no little breadcrumb trail to follow. You've essentially taken their conversational offering, their question, and returned nothing that can be easily built upon. The conversation stalls, and honestly, the other person might start to feel like maybe you're not very interested in talking, or maybe you're just kind of reserved.
Okay, so the powerful advice from the source here is actually pretty simple, but incredibly effective when you think about it. When you answer, always try to add at least one extra piece of relevant information. Or, even better, include a follow-up question that bounces the conversational ball right back to them.
This is where you shift from just being a responder to being an active contributor to the flow. It's about co-creating the conversation. Let's look at that traveling example again. Instead of just yes to, do you like traveling? The source suggests a much better response. Something like, yes, I love traveling. Actually, last year I went to Thailand and it was amazing. Have you ever been there?
Okay, let's dissect that specific answer because it really demonstrates the technique perfectly. You start with the direct answer. Yes, I love traveling. Simple, clear. You answered the question.
Right, you address the question directly first. That's important. But then you immediately add, actually, last year I went to Thailand and it was amazing. This is the crucial added detail. It's specific Thailand, not just abroad. It includes a personal reaction. It was amazing. This gives the other person something concrete to latch onto. Maybe they've been to Thailand too. Maybe they've always wanted to go. Maybe they'll ask why it was amazing or what part of Thailand you visited or what you did there. So many possibilities open up.
And then the masterstroke, as you called it. Have you ever been there?
That's the follow-up question. It's brilliant because you've answered their question, you've provided them with interesting new information, and then you've immediately given them a clear, easy way to respond and keep the conversation moving. You've handed the ball back, polished, and ready for them to hit it.
So your answer isn't just the end of your turn, it's actually the setup for their next turn. It's like you're building a little conversational bridge with each response you give.
Precisely. You're not just receiving information, you're actively contributing to the ongoing exchange. You're adding value. The source emphasizes that adding even just one small detail where you went, what you liked about something, how you felt, when it happened, provides the other person with material to react to. It gives them something tangible, and including that follow-up question directly invites them to speak, which removes the burden from them to think of a completely new topic or question on the spot. It makes it easy for them.
This really changes the mindset, doesn't it? It's not just about answering correctly or giving the information asked for. It's about actively participating in keeping the dialogue alive. It turns answers into launching pads for more conversation.
It's a fundamental shift in perspective, I think. It requires you to think not just about what the answer is, but how you can make your answer a stepping stone for the rest of the conversation. And this applies even for questions that might not seem to have an obvious detail, like the classic, "How are you?" Instead of just "fine, thanks," or "good, you," you could add a small detail about your day or how you're really feeling, assuming it's appropriate for the context, of course. Like, "I'm doing pretty well, thanks. A little tired today, though. I had a late night finishing up a project." Or maybe, "I'm great. Just enjoying this sunshine finally. It feels like it's been ages."
Yeah, and those small additions provide texture, right? And potential follow-ups. Oh, what project were you working on? Or, yes, the weather is beautiful, isn't it? It makes such a difference. It just gives the other person something to respond to beyond good.
Exactly. Detail plus, ideally, a return question. That's the combo.
Okay, so we're building conversations by asking open questions and giving detailed answers that include follow-ups. Makes sense. Now let's move to something that really helps people sound naturally fluent, those little linguistic lubricants that pepper native speech. The sources talk about filler phrases, but not necessarily the kind that mean you're totally lost for words, but the kind that actually smooth out the flow.
Exactly. That's a key distinction. These phrases are often used quite unconsciously by native speakers, but they serve really important functions. They can buy you a moment to think, they can soften a response, show slight hesitation or nuance, or simply make the conversation sound less stilted and more, well, human. And the sources point out something interesting. Native speakers rarely use abrupt, one-word answers like a bare yes or no or I don't know. There's usually something padding it out a bit.
Okay, so give us some alternatives from the source material for those common, potentially blunt responses. What do people often use instead of just yes?
Well, instead of a clipped yes, you'll frequently hear variations that add a bit of nuance or emphasis. Yeah is incredibly common. Obviously much more casual than yes.
Oh,
Yeah, definitely adds strong agreement and emphasis. Absolutely is another strong affirmative, maybe slightly more formal than yeah, definitely.
yeah.
Even just a simple while nodding often serves as a verbal yes that feels less formal than saying the full word.
Right. And for no, which can sound quite negative or even confrontational on its own sometimes.
Yeah, no is often softened significantly. Not really is a very, very common way to express partial disagreement or a negative answer without sounding harsh or abrupt. The sources also provide examples that cleverly combine this softening with our earlier point about adding detail or possibility. So instead of just no to, say, "Do you like skydiving?" You might hear, "Not really, but I'd love to try it someday." See how that works. It acknowledges the premise of the question, responds negatively, "Not really," but immediately opens a new door. "But I'd love to try it someday," which the other person can then pick up on. "Oh, really? What makes you want to try it?"
That's a great technique. It keeps the potential topic alive even if your direct answer is negative. It doesn't just shut the door. What about when you simply don't have the information? Just saying, I don't know, can sometimes feel like you're shutting down the conversation or not being helpful.
Right, it can feel a bit like a dead end itself. The sources offer much more engaging ways to handle this. Instead of a plain, "I don't know," you can use phrases that show you've actually considered the question and aren't just dismissing it out of hand. Something like, that's a good question. That's excellent." It buys you a second. It validates the question, acknowledges its value, and shows you're actually thinking about it.
Mm.
And you could often pair this with a brief reason why you don't know, as the source suggests. That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that before. Or maybe that's a good point. I'm actually not sure about the exact figures for that.
These variations sound so much more engaged and thoughtful, don't they? Compared to just a flat, I don't know. They maintain the connection even when you're expressing uncertainty.
Exactly. They keep the interaction positive and show respect for the questioner. The sources also list a couple more general filler phrases that are just sprinkled throughout native speech all the time. Well, actually, is one.
Ah, well, actually, that often signals that you're about to provide maybe a slightly corrected piece of information or a more detailed, perhaps counterintuitive explanation, right?
That's precisely. It prepares the listener for a minor adjustment or an expansion on what might be assumed or what was just said. Like if someone asks, did
Yeah.
you finish that project? Instead of just no, you might say, well, actually, I finished the main report part, but I'm just pulling together the presentation slides now. It's more detailed, more nuanced. And then there's the ubiquitous, you know.
Oh, you hear that one constantly. Sometimes it seems almost meaningless, like just a verbal to tick, but it does serve a function, doesn't it?
It really does. It can be used to check for shared understanding or common ground.
Yeah.
And that's when the server crashed. Or it can simply be a subtle way to keep the conversational thread going while the speaker gathers their next thought. Kind of like a soft pause signal that invites the listener to stay with you. Now, obviously, overusing any filler can become distracting, but using these common ones appropriately makes your speech sound significantly more fluid and less effortful. More like how a native speaker would naturally pause or respond.
So it's about embracing those little imperfections, maybe the slight hesitations that are actually a natural part of spontaneous speech, rather than striving for this absolute robotic silence between perfectly formed sentences. Fillers are part of the rhythm.
They absolutely are. They provide the beat and the texture of natural conversation. Incorporating even just one or two of these consciously into your responses, like trying out, not really, instead of no,
Yeah.
or that's a good question, instead of I don't know, can make a noticeable difference in how comfortable and fluent you sound.
Okay, fantastic. So we've covered asking questions that invite depth, giving answers that provide hooks, and using fillers for smoother delivery. Really useful stuff. But sometimes, even with all these techniques firing on all cylinders, a topic just naturally reaches its conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Or you realize, okay, we need to shift gears here. Doing this smoothly, without that awkward jolt or sudden silence, is another key skill our sources address. Mastering transitions.
Right, because abrupt topic changes can be really jarring for the listener. They can feel random and kind of uncomfortable for the speaker too sometimes. They break the flow rather than redirecting it gently. So the sources provide some excellent transition phrases specifically designed to act as bridges between one topic and the next.
Okay, let's go through the ones they highlight. The first one mentioned is, that reminds me.
Yeah, that reminds me. It's ideal for when something that was just said, maybe even a minor point or a specific word someone used, triggers an association in your mind to something potentially quite different that you want to talk about. You basically vocalize that connection, even if it's a bit of a loose one, just to make the transition feel less random and more organic. The source example is very clear on this. Let's say the conversation was somehow related to travel. Maybe someone mentioned their daily commute or planning a weekend trip somewhere nearby. You could use that as the springboard. Oh, speaking of trips, that reminds me. Have you ever been to Japan?
Okay, so the previous topic, maybe travel or planning a trip, acts as the anchor. And that reminds me, signals that you're linking your next point, which is about Japan, back to that anchor, even if Japan wasn't the main focus before. It justifies the shift.
Exactly. It provides a rationale, a reason for why you're suddenly bringing up Japan. It feels connected, not just pulled out of the blue. Another useful phrase is, speaking of that.
Right. How does speaking of that differ from, that reminds me? Pow! They sound kind of similar.
They are similar, but speaking of that, is generally used when you want to stay within the general sphere of the current topic, but maybe shift focus to a specific related aspect, or perhaps drill down on something that was just mentioned. It's usually a tighter, more direct link then. That reminds me. The source uses the example. If you were just discussing travel broadly, maybe different types of trips people enjoy, or places you've all been, you could use, speaking of travel, do you have a dream destination? You're still on the topic of travel, but you've narrowed it down to a specific question about future aspirations, prompted by the ongoing travel discussion.
Got it. So speaking of that, is good for moving maybe from a broad topic to a more specific point within that same topic, or picking up on a specific word or idea that was just articulated by someone.
Yes, exactly. It signals that you're elaborating on or redirecting a related part of the existing discussion, rather than jumping to something new triggered by association. And the third transition phrase the sources recommend is, oh, by the way.
This one feels like the most sort of direct way to introduce something genuinely new, doesn't it? Less of a connection needed.
It is. Typically, oh, by the way, is the phrase you often use when the new topic you want to introduce doesn't necessarily have a direct logical link to the previous one. Maybe you just thought of something important you need to ask or share, or you decided now is a good time to bring it up before you forget. It signals a shift in direction, but it does so casually, gently, making it less abrupt than just blurting out the new topic. The source example is straightforward. Oh, by the way, did you see the news today? Unless your conversation was already about current events, this is clearly introducing something fresh, but the by the way softens the transition.
It's like the conversational equivalent of saying, just as a side note, or, oh, before I forget, or on a completely different topic.
Yeah,
But it sounds much smoother and more integrated. It just prepares the listener for a slight pivot.
absolutely. These transition phrases, that reminds me, speaking of that. Oh, by the way, they're incredibly useful tools in your conversational toolkit. They help prevent those awkward pauses or mental restarts where you're hesitating, wondering, how can I bring up this other thing I want to talk about?
Yeah.
They provide ready-made structures to steer the conversation smoothly, making you feel more in control and the listener feel more comfortable following your train of thought. Mastering them really makes your conversation feel more effortless and, frankly, more sophisticated.
Okay, this is great. We've covered the mechanics, the questions, the answers, the fillers, the transitions. That feels like a really solid technical foundation for keeping things flowing. But the sources make a really important point, and you touched on this earlier. Conversation isn't just a technical exchange of words, it's deeply, deeply intertwined with culture. To truly keep a conversation going naturally in English, you really need to understand some of the cultural expectations behind it all.
This is such a critical layer because what's considered polite or engaging or even just normal in a conversation can vary significantly from one culture to another. Just applying the techniques we've discussed, like asking open questions or adding detail, without this cultural awareness, well, it might still feel a little off somehow or maybe not land quite right. And one of the major cultural elements the sources really highlight for English-speaking contexts is small talk.
Ah, small talk. That often underestimated, sometimes even maligned part of English conversation. Our sources describe it as a huge part of daily interactions. Is it really that big a deal?
It really is fundamental, particularly in countries like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Small talk serves this crucial social lubricant function. It's not usually about having a deep intellectual discussion, not at first anyway. It's more about establishing a connection, creating a comfortable atmosphere between people. And often it's about testing the waters before potentially moving on to more substantial topics, or sometimes just enjoying a brief, light, friendly interaction and acknowledging the other person's presence.
So it's that kind of casual chat you might have before a meeting officially starts, or while you're waiting in line for coffee, or even like in the elevator with a colleague.
Exactly. It happens everywhere. At work, in shops, at social gatherings, school events, waiting rooms, you name it. Anywhere people are gathered informally or semi-formally, it's those brief, usually non-threatening exchanges that acknowledge the other person, make things feel less awkward, and fill those potentially uncomfortable silences.
Okay, but you can't just talk about anything, right? What are the typical safe topics for small talk, according to the sources? Because getting this wrong could be awkward too.
Definitely. The sources are quite specific about this. They specify neutral, easily accessible topics that most people can relate to and probably have an opinion on without getting too personal or controversial early on. The absolute classics, the most common ones mentioned, are the weather.
Always the weather.
Always the weather. TV shows or movies. Weekend plans, either upcoming or past, and maybe sports if it seems appropriate for the context or the person. These are considered universally applicable and generally low-risk topics. Most people can say something about the weather or what they did over the weekend.
So classic small talk phrases would be things like, gosh, it's been so hot lately, hasn't it? Or, did you happen to watch the latest episode of that show everyone's talking about? Or, got any fun plans for the weekend?
Precisely those kinds of questions. And the expected responses are usually equally light and non-committal. To, any fun plans for the weekend? Cow. You might hear back, oh, nothing much, just hoping to relax a bit, or, yeah, actually, I'm going to a friend's birthday party on Saturday. These are easy to answer and as often offer simple follow-up points if you want to continue. Just relaxing, sounds nice, has it been a busy week? Or, oh, a birthday party, anyone I might know. It keeps the light exchange going.
But importantly, the sources give a really firm warning about what not to talk about in small talk situations.
Yes, and this is absolutely vital cultural knowledge to avoid making people uncomfortable. In many English-speaking contexts, certain topics are considered private or potentially divisive. They're generally best avoided in casual small talk, especially with people you don't know very well. The sources specifically list money, like salaries or how much things cost, religion, and politics.
Right, you wouldn't typically walk up to a colleague you barely know and ask them how much they earn or what their specific religious beliefs are or who they voted for in the last election. That would be jarring.
Absolutely not. That would be considered quite inappropriate in most initial interactions. These topics can easily lead to discomfort, offense, or immediate disagreement, which completely defeats the purpose of small talk. Remember, the goal is to build easy rapport and find common ground. So the advice is clear. Stick to those general, universally applicable topics like weather, hobbies, weekend plans, maybe work projects if you're colleagues. Unless the conversation naturally deepens with someone you know well and they initiate discussion of more personal subjects, it's best to stay in the safe zone. Small talk is about finding that safe common ground first.
Okay, that's super helpful. So small talk is key for those short, light interactions, getting things started. What about keeping longer conversations engaging once you're past the initial small talk? The sources mention storytelling as another really powerful cultural element in English conversation.
Yes, storytelling is highly valued, particularly in many Western cultures. People generally love hearing personal experiences and anecdotes, even short ones. It's a primary way people entertain each other, share a part of themselves, build connection, and make their points more relatable and memorable than just stating facts.
So the idea is instead of just stating a fact or giving a very short answer, you try to expand it into a mini narrative, like a little story from your life.
Exactly. It transforms a potentially simple response into a much more engaging moment for the listener. The sources illustrate this brilliantly, using the same example we touched on earlier for adding detail. The question, how's your weekend? The minimal answer, as we know, is, it was good, which is conversationally, well, pretty dead.
Right. Nothing for the other person to work with, but the storytelling version is much richer and really invites engagement, doesn't it?
It really does. Instead of just, it was good, the source suggests you could answer with a brief narrative, something like, oh, it was actually really fun. On Saturday, I went hiking with some friends, and we actually discovered this amazing hidden waterfall way back in the woods. Honestly, it felt like a real adventure finding it. And then on Sunday, I tried making homemade pizza for the first time. But it turned into a complete disaster. I totally smoked up the whole kitchen.
Haha. See, that's such a vivid response. It paints a picture, and it contains multiple potential hooks for the listener, doesn't it? A success story and a funny failure.
It does. By sharing two distinct little experiences, one positive adventure, one humorous mishap, you've given the other person clear options for how to respond. They can choose which thread to pull on. As the sources point out, they might focus on the hiking part. Wow, a hidden waterfall, that sounds incredible. Whereabouts was it? Or, oh, I love hiking too. Any other good trails around here? Or maybe they relate more to the cooking disaster. Oh no, a pizza disaster. Haha, I've totally had those. What went wrong? Or, oh dear, reminds me of the time I almost set my kitchen on fire making pancakes.
And each of those potential responses naturally leads to their own questions, or perhaps them sharing a similar experience of their own, creating a true back and forth. It feels much more like a real connection than just summarizing good.
It makes the conversation feel more personal, more lively, and definitely more memorable. You're not just exchanging basic information, you're sharing experiences, and maybe even a little vulnerability or humor. Telling a short story, even if it's just 2 or 3 sentences long, makes your responses far more interesting and provides concrete, relatable material for the other person to react to. And that keeps the conversation flowing much more naturally and makes it more fun.
Okay, so small talk for the light interactions, storytelling for more engaging responses later on. What's the final crucial cultural piece the sources identify for smooth English conversation? It relates to what you do when the other person is talking. It's about active listening.
Yes, this is paramount. In many English-speaking cultures, listening isn't generally seen as a passive activity where you just sit silently and absorb information. You are often expected to actively show that you are listening and engaged. And you do this through both verbal and nonverbal signals. And this, the sources note, can contrast quite significantly with some other cultures where perhaps attentive listening is expressed more through quiet stillness and maintaining eye contact.
So just being silent, even if you're actually paying really close attention internally, might be misinterpreted in an English-speaking context, maybe as disinterest or boredom.
It absolutely can be, unfortunately. Without those little signals of engagement, the speaker might start to wonder if you're following along or if you're bored or perhaps even if you don't understand what they're saying. Active listening provides this ongoing feedback loop that encourages the speaker, confirms your engagement, and makes them feel heard.
Okay, so what are some of the key verbal cues for active listening that the sources list? Those little sounds or short phrases you make while someone else is speaking.
Right, these are the affirmative sounds and brief interjections, sometimes called back channeling. Very common ones include things like, uh-huh, which is like a verbal nod. Yeah, right, okay, I see, just showing you're tracking. And then there are slightly more specific reactions that show your emotional response, like, oh, really? No way, often used to show positive surprise or impressiveness. Wow, that sounds amazing. That's interesting. Or empathetic responses like, oh, that's tough, or I see what you mean.
Yeah, no way is such a natural, common reaction to something surprising or impressive. Using something like that instinctively sounds so much more engaged than just maintaining a blank stare, even if you are interested.
Totally. They are like little conversational hooks or signals that you throw out while the other person is speaking, just to show you're right there with them, tracking what they're saying and reacting to it in real time. They often fill very short natural pauses in the speaker's flow, and they really encourage the speaker to continue because they feel heard and they feel like their points are landing effectively.
And it's not just sounds and words, right? Body language plays a big role in showing active listening, too.
It absolutely does. The sources mention key nonverbal cues that typically signal active listening in this cultural context. These include consistently making eye contact, not staring intensely, but regularly meeting their gaze. Also, nodding your head occasionally to show agreement or understanding, and sometimes slightly leaning forward can indicate increased interest and engagement in what they're saying.
So, practicing active listening really involves consciously using these verbal and nonverbal signals together. It's a whole package. The sources even suggest practicing using simple verbal cues like, oh, wow, or that's interesting, almost as like knee-jerk reactions while someone is talking just to get used to doing it.
Exactly. Try to make it a habit. These micro-responses demonstrate engagement and make the entire interaction feel much more dynamic and natural, less like a monologue exchange. And when you show you're listening actively, the other person feels more comfortable, more validated, and is actually more likely to share more detailed answers or stories, which in turn provides you with more material for your own responses and questions. So it feeds back positively into everything else we've discussed. It's really a fundamental component of the conversational rhythm in English.
Wow, this has been incredibly practical. We've really dug into both the sentence level techniques, questions, answers, fillers, transitions, and the broader cultural landscape. So, asking the right questions, giving answers that build, smoothing things out with fillers, transitioning topics gracefully, and crucially, understanding the cultural importance of small talk, storytelling, and actively showing you're listening. Now, the big challenge, of course, is putting all of this into practice. And our sources wrap up with some really clear, actionable steps for you, the listener, to try, maybe even today.
Yes, and they distill everything into a simple, manageable challenge. The key is not to feel pressure to implement everything all at once. That would be overwhelming.
Right. So, step one, choose a conversation topic. The sources suggest starting with something relatively easy and common, something you might actually talk about, like music, travel, food, or hobbies. Pick one you genuinely have some interest in talking about.
Step 2. When you have a chance to have a conversation on that topic, consciously practice asking those open-ended questions. Remind yourself beforehand. Use what, how, or why instead of, do you play any sports? Why? What sports do you enjoy watching or playing? Or how did you first get into that particular sport? Just try one or two.
And step 3, focus on trying to use just one of the other techniques we discussed in that conversation. Maybe your goal for that chat is simply to add one extra relevant detail to each of your answers. Or maybe you decide to focus on using just one specific filler phrase, like consciously trying to use not really instead of a flat no, or using, that's a good question when the opportunity arises instead of just saying, I don't know.
The key is that conscious effort initially. Start small. Pick just one area to focus on for a specific conversation and try to apply it. It could be with a language exchange partner, a teacher, a colleague during a coffee break, or even in a low-stakes social interaction like chatting with a cashier briefly. Just try it out.
And as you try this, remember that incredibly powerful closing thought we found echoed in the source material. English is about connection, not perfection.
This is so, so vital to remember. Don't let the fear of making a mistake paralyze you or stop you from speaking. The ultimate goal of conversation, in any language, is to connect with another human being. It's about sharing ideas, experiences, maybe some feelings, minor grammatical errors, or slightly awkward phrasing. Honestly, they are completely secondary to establishing that human connection. Most people are very forgiving.
Yeah, focus on understanding and being understood. Use these techniques we've discussed today as tools, just tools to help you make that connection more easily and keep it going more smoothly. The more you practice, even in small ways, the more natural these things will become over time. So just keep talking, keep practicing, and remember to try and have some fun with the process too.
Absolutely. Experiment a little, see what feels comfortable for you, try out different approaches we talked about, and definitely celebrate the small victories. Notice when you successfully kept a conversation flowing just a little bit longer or a little more smoothly than maybe you did before. That's progress.
Definitely. And as you reflect on everything we've discussed in this deep dive, here's maybe a final thought to take with you, something to mull over. We've highlighted how English conversation style often includes these cultural elements, specific small talk topics, the value placed on storytelling, the expectation of visible, active listening. Thinking about how your own first language or your own cultural background influences your natural conversation style can be just as illuminating as learning the English norms. How does your culture typically handle pauses in conversation? How do people usually show they're listening? What topics are considered light or appropriate for initial conversation where you come from? And reflecting on that, what aspect of the English conversation style we discussed today feels the most different or maybe even surprising compared to what you're used to? And based on that difference, what specific trick or technique from this deep dive do you think you will consciously try to apply first in your very next English conversation? Keep those reflections going and keep those conversations flowing.
Absolutely. Until the next deep dive.